Entrepreneurial Edge is brought to you by Business Banking from FNB, because small ideas can lead to big business. FNB, how can we help you?
Hello and welcome to the Entrepreneurial Edge. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, when it comes to the computer software business, 1978 is about as remote as 1878. In 1978, it was a different world. It was a year that saw two popes. Pope John Paul was elected and died to be replaced by the Polish Pope, John Paul II. The United States agreed to give back the Panama Canal. Argentina beat Holland to win the World Cup. OPEC raised the price of oil by 14%. Well, maybe things haven't changed that much. Now, 1978 was also the year Phil Duff arrived here in South Africa to start up a software business with his brother Chris. These were the days when most people hadn't even heard of software. The company, Syspro, survived and prospered from one century into the next. Let's take a look at where the company is 34 years later.
Syspro's got quite an interesting history because it's mainly family-based. And what happened was Phil Duff, who's our current CEO, his brother was living in South Africa, and in 1978, he called Phil and he said, listen, ICL have just given me this amazing contract. So I need you to come out and help me because I've got this product, I need to develop it. And what happened was Phil hopped on the next plane, the psychology major, no formal IT background. And he and Chris developed Syspro in Chris's garage. And from there, Chris was the marketing guy, Phil was the IT guy. And today, 30 years later, Phil is still the brains behind the technology of Syspro. Syspro is actually a business application. If you consider people like South African breweries, who's a customer of ours, Nestle throughout Asia, Hitachi, also scattered around Europe, America, they all use Syspro to basically record their transactions through their day-to-day processing. So it's actually a business application which spans across multiple industries, whether you are a component manufacturer, whether you're in the mining or farming, or whether you manufacture finished goods. Syspro will handle the business side of all of those transactions. Syspro started off many years ago with a product called Stars or Safes. That was our predecessor. From there we released a product called Impact, which ran on the old green screens, and Impact Award was its superseded it, and then we came up with Impact Encore, which is our first Windows-based product. And from there we actually got to the point where we said, you know, we've got limited resources, both financial and people. We're trying to market a company called Syspro, a product called Impact, so why don't we combine the two? So in 2003, we changed our whole rebranding and we called ourselves the product and the company Syspro. Well, as I mentioned, started in South Africa, so our biggest footprint is actually in Africa. However, we have offices in Canada, in the US, in Manchester, in the UK, which Phil's brother originally started. From there, we have an office in Sydney, Australia, who cover the whole of the Asia Pac, and we've recently opened an office in Singapore. We have over 14,000 customers worldwide, and our reach is in 60 countries across the world. Phil's passionate about the product. Whether he's on holiday, wherever he goes, his laptop's with him, or he's got his cell phone or his iPad, he's constantly working. And it's not drudgery to him. He honestly, genuinely loves technology. And the unique thing about Phil is he'll be made aware of a new technology and he can interpret that into something that would be useful for our customers. So he's the ideas behind Syspro. He's a great ambassador. He loves going to the conferences and presenting the product and seeing the response he gets from the customers out there.
Well, in the studio with me, I have Phil Duff, the co-founder and CEO of Syspro, a company now which is turning over something like $70 million a year in revenue. Just take you right back to the beginning. It must have been strange when your brother phoned up from South Africa, a country you'd never been to, and said, look, come over here, we're going to start a computer business. Just tell us what happened.
Well, I was working for Brittany Ferries, a cross-channel ferry company from Plymouth to Roscoff, and yes, he phoned me up April 1977 and said, why don't I come out to South Africa and form a computer company, something I knew nothing about, and there was obviously very early days for computers, and yeah, I decided, yes, why not, I'll emigrate, so I did, and contacted the South African Embassy. They gave me a one-way ticket and £25 in my back pocket, and Off I set, rather apprehensive at the time, I seem to recollect.
So when you arrived here and you finally got the business starting, how humble were those beginnings?
Well, you know, that was a long time ago. And, you know, we had no concept of where it might end up. Maybe 7 or 8 years later, we had some idea of creating package software, which was sort of relatively unknown then. But in the early days, it was simply a question of creating a company and doing what we call bespoke work, meaning tailored programming around. Then was a reasonably popular package called STARS from ICL, International Computers Limited, and we wrote around that. And we simply wrote more and more work around this product, and we realized there was a market to create more tailored approach. And it was simply unheard of. People didn't, the idea of doing recurring revenue, if that makes sense, to say, well, if you create something, why not make the same thing available to hundreds of people or thousands of people? It was unheard of. You wrote programs, and I write a few personally. I go to the next client. So the notion of taking a piece of software, am I going on too long about this?
No.
But this is how the whole thing started, because...
So it was a bit like a suit then. You made exactly what somebody wanted and fitted, and
there was nothing wrong with doing it. The tailored approach was the correct approach, but we felt there was a way of engaging a wider audience. Even in 1984 was when we came up with the idea that we should take some of the work we'd done and make it available to literally as many people as we can lay our hands on.
So those days you couldn't go to the computer shop and buy this sort of software because there were no computer shops.
Oh, there was no computer shop, there's no internet, there was no cell phones, there was no way of actually really distributing the software in any way that made sense.
But as an entrepreneur, it must have been quite difficult for you, because surely when you told people what you did, most people, 99% of people, wouldn't even understand what on earth you were doing.
Well, that's...
How was that?
Well, I suppose that's true, and so the people, if I had a conversation at a dinner party, I'd end up saying I'm a gynecologist. It was anything to get someone to actually have a conversation with me, because you say you're on computers, they sort of stare blank. In fact, it still happens to this day. People still stare blankly at me. But
and from that garage, I mean, you started in a garage like most entrepreneurs. Who was your first client? I mean, do you remember that elation of making your first sale?
Well, it was a company called Hippo Manufacturing. And or the Hippo, I don't know if they're still around, but they were extremely helpful. You know, you talk about entrepreneurs and how they start in the game and how do they get from a 2-person company to be $1 million, whatever it might be. Well, we were sort of unlucky and lucky at the same time. We were very fortunate to come across this company called Hippo Manufacturing. They needed some software written for them, so Chris and I, we tentatively got the job and we started writing for them. And we got very friendly with the MD, and he was extremely helpful. And at some point, when Chris and I realized the only way to write more and more software was to create it using your own machine. Well, there were no laptops. And the notion of having your own computer was like, what do you mean? Because you had to have a room this size to have a decent computer. I mean, it's huge. But we managed to persuade Pat, I can't remember his surname now, at Hippo, to sell us his current computer, and he was extremely helpful. He actually gave us on a loan, and that's really what made us start taking off and writing more and more software. So we were fortunate in that sense, and we were unlucky in the sense no one else really wanted to help us.
And that first
like
invoice?
Banks, never wanted to help us.
How much was it, and how satisfying was it?
What?
The first invoice?
Well, it was odd, because you remember those old typewriters? You know, the things you clunk like this? The very first invoice was Chris. I remember him doing it. He was sitting next to me, and we were saying, look, we've done this work, some sales analysis program, and what do you think? I said, I don't know. I have no idea how much we've spent, a few hours or weeks, whatever, doing it. I don't know. Well, we dreamt up a figure, literally, and then we trebled it, thinking they'll never go for it. Well, they did, because they had no idea. So our first invoice, and I think we've got it framed somewhere, but it was on those, it looks like old parchment these days with this funny letters on the typewriter where you can't see the numbers. So yes, the very first invoice, number 1, I remember typing the 1. So
let's talk a little bit more about you and your background. Now, your father, you said, was an engineer. He worked in the shipyards in the UK. But you say your grandfather was an entrepreneur, and also he bequeathed you a cautionary tale when it comes to entrepreneurs. Tell us about that.
Yes, you know, over the years, people have suggested, why don't I list, and why don't I invest in this and that? And I've been very cautious about doing that. And I won't forget the tale that my father told me. It was quite some years ago. And we were talking about, said, you know, Dad, about your dad, tell me some stories. He said, well, actually, it wasn't a happy story. I said, well, tell me the story. 1929, February 1929, thereabouts. My father's father was quite wealthy in his own right, and he decided that it would be a great thing to invest all the money. He had a foundry or something like that, and he thought he'd sold the whole lot, and he'd invest everything, every last cent, into stocks and shares in February 1929. And by October, he'd lost a lot. And what he had a stroke. It was a very sad story, but he had a stroke, and overnight he was paralyzed from the waist downwards, and my father had to look after him from there on in, and he was only 14 or 15 at the time. So it was a salutary lesson. I've never forgotten the story. You have to be so careful about what you'll do with your money, and it's still to this day, people do not fully understand how IT companies work. Things like Facebook and Google. I mean, Facebook is currently valued 100 times its actual real value. And it may never change. I mean, people are quite happy to invest in things like that. So,
what did you think of that listing, just by the way? I mean, 100 billion, was it not?
Something ridiculous, 125 or something.
What did you think?
Well, I think fantastic to Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, it's sort of, well, good for him, but it's grossly overpriced for the value it doesn't really create any true value. It just connects people, albeit 600 million people. Or something.
I mean, looking at Facebook now, in 1978, when you were writing your programs, yeah. Did you ever think something like that would happen?
No. And the notion of the internet, or where you could connect computers to each computer and have things done automatically. I mean, the days when we wrote software, you had to do something. You as an operator, you would key something in and something would whir away, the lights would flash, and something magical would happen. But the notion of having these machines connected together and having something in your hand, I mean, a cell phone today has more computing power than about 10 times of the computers I used to work with in 1978. So it is a remarkable, in what, 34 years, how much the industry has changed. And if you think where we are now, in another 34 years, it's very difficult to comprehend where we're going to get to.
Now we're going to talk a lot more in the second half about the market and where your company is going. But I mean, do you see this as the rest of your working life? What you're doing?
Oh, absolutely. Every morning I wake up, and I don't know about your job, and you interview. You know, you told me you've interviewed a lot of people, and you wake up in the morning, you've got another interview. Do you say to yourself, "Oh God, not another interview," or do you think, you know what? There's another interview, another interesting angle. And I wake up every morning thinking, this is the first day of Syspro. Does that make sense? It's almost like a startup, and I keep viewing it like that. And I don't know why I view it like that, but I view it like a company that's about to get out of the starting gate, not one that's actually quite a mature company.
Well, let me tell you, as a journalist, I wake up every single morning thinking this is the next day of the rest of my life. I can tell you, I wake up with the joys of spring every day.
Oh, that's good.
I can tell you that for nothing. We're going to go to a short ad break. When we return, we'll find out more about Syspro's footprint in Africa.